This jet terrified the West, the MiG-25 Foxbat.
This video was made possible by CuriosityStream. Watch thousands of high-quality documentaries and get access to my streaming service Nebula using the link in the description.
Čia apie naikintuvą, kurio vakarai bijojo.
Fighter jets race to intercept an unidentified aircraft. The F-4 Phantoms are among the fastest fighter jets in the world. But they're not fast enough because they're chasing a MiG-25, a plane that can fly so fast and high it can outrun any fighter or air defense system. For nearly a decade, the Soviet Union's MiG-25 will remain a complete mystery and leave Western intelligence scrambling for answers. In the opening years of the Cold War, a new kind of weapon emerged, the intercontinental bomber. An aircraft with enough range to reach nearly any part of the world to deliver a nuclear strike. America's first intercontinental bomber not only flew further, it flew higher and faster than any bomber before it, making it extremely difficult to intercept. And it started a decades-long trend of building strategic bombers that flew ever higher and faster. The Soviet Union responded by building increasingly capable fighter interceptors to try and stop them.
Čia aš atsimenu, kuo tu aukščiau skrendi ir kuo greičiau skrendi, tave sunkiau numušti. Nu, detektinti turbūt vis tiek detektins, bet numušti su visokiom ten, nežinau, antioro sistemom. Čia dėl to reikia aukščiau ir greičiau skristi, ar koks būtent pranašumas?
But by the late 1950s, Soviet intelligence had learned that the Americans were developing a new state-of-the-art bomber that would fly so high and fast, it would render the entire Soviet Air Force virtually obsolete. The XB-70 was so cutting-edge that only a few years earlier it would have been impossible to build. But the Americans were aiming to have the bomber ready in just a few short years. For Soviet leadership, a sense of panic set in. As the largest country in the world, there were over 22 million square kilometers of airspace to guard, and at any moment, American bombers could emerge from the north, or from bases in the east, or NATO-allied countries in the west. And only a handful of supersonic bombers would be enough to overwhelm air defenses. The Soviet Union would have just a few short years to design and build a new interceptor to match the incredible performance of the upcoming B-70. It would have to be as fast as Soviet ingenuity could make it, and developed in record time. But to effectively guard the country's enormous airspace, they'd also need to mass-produce the new jet by the hundreds. The MiG-25 was the Soviet Union's answer, an interceptor that would overcome the odds with brute force. To catch the XB-70, engineers would need to equip the MiG with enormously powerful engines, but there wouldn't be time to develop new ones. Instead, they'd make do with a turbojet originally built to power cruise missiles and reconnaissance drones. They were the largest engines ever put on a fighter, but they were essentially disposable. It meant that initial versions of the MiG had engines with a service life of just 150 hours. At intercept speeds, the MiG-25 would have to withstand serious kinetic heating, with some parts reaching 300 degrees Celsius. But lightweight, heat-resistant titanium was just too difficult to produce on a mass scale. So engineers built the jet largely out of heavy.
Taip, kad tai atrodo tas MiGas. Apsitai lėktuvai žiūri, kad tai fucking atrodo. Ypač tie visokie, gal ne tie dideli bomberiai, bet tie naikintuvai, jie nežinau, visą laiką, kad tai atrodo. Nu, jie turi būti, I guess, kad iš tikrųjų, jie kad tai atrodo netgi natūraliai, man atrodo, nes jų formos turi būti tokios ten, kad tas oro visas sroves ten, nu, pasipriešinimą optimizuoti. Jie taip pas nenatūraliai atrodo, kad tai.
Heavy nickel steel alloy, a material that could be quickly welded together and easily repaired at even the most remote and ill-equipped airbase. But it meant that the more than 40,000-pound jet could never be maneuverable, a characteristic considered irrelevant for its mission. To spot enemy bombers, the MiG-25 was equipped with a colossal 600-kilowatt radar, designed to detect high-flying aircraft up to 100 kilometers away and burn right through their jamming devices. And it would need only one kind of weapon, 4 of the largest air-to-air missiles ever produced. Along with the interceptor, there would also be a dedicated reconnaissance version with
Norėčiau pasakyti su naikintuvu. Tai pala, mes tai nuolptumėm tiesiog, ne? Nuo tų visų ten G-forces. O, guess, gal jeigu tiesiai skristi, ne, bet tipo, jeigu nors biškai pradėtų ten naviguoti, pizdės mums iš karto, aš nežinau.
powerful surveillance cameras, increased range, and an even higher service ceiling. Some versions could even be equipped for high-altitude bombing.
Ai, nu tipo jo, iš esmės... Oi. Kuo greičiau nuskrendi, tuo greičiau gali susprogdinti bombonešį, jo, kol nespės išmest bombų.
But the vast majority of MiG-25s would be built as dedicated interceptors. Mass production began in 1969, and at one point, 100 MiG-25s were rolling off assembly lines every single month. The MiG-25 would fly higher and faster than any combat jet in history, and it would have a profound effect on the Cold War, just not in the way the Soviets were expecting. In 1967, the Soviet Union put on a massive air show, and they made sure the Americans were watching. The event was even broadcast in English for Western audiences. The Soviets unveiled several new aircraft for the very first time, but they saved the best for last. In the final 10 minutes, 3 prototype MiG-25s were sent roaring past the audience. It was the first time anyone outside the Soviet Union would see the new aircraft. And for Western intelligence, it set off alarm bells. The grainy footage revealed an aircraft with all the hallmarks of an agile fighter. The unusually large wings suggested extreme maneuverability. Enormous air intakes hinted at massive engines. And experts suspected the use of advanced lightweight titanium. But what worried them the most was that the plane looked eerily similar to concepts for America's next-generation air superiority fighter, a jet that wouldn't be ready for another 10 years. In Washington, military planners struggled to understand how the Soviets could have leapfrogged so far ahead, because only a few months later, the Soviet Union started registering incredible new records for speed and altitude. And the media soon caught wind, spreading fears that the mysterious new jet could outperform anything built by the West. The U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff even publicly admitted that for the first time, the Soviets had a jet that the United States couldn't match. The perceived threat motivated the U.S. to drastically increase performance targets for its next-generation fighters. But for years, the Americans were desperate for any information they could get. They'd catch another glimpse in 1971 when Israeli radar controllers began tracking MiG-25s over the Sinai Peninsula. The jets were clocked flying at more than 2.5 times the speed of sound and at an altitude of over 20 kilometers. At one point, they even tracked one of the MiGs accelerating beyond Mach 3. But the jets flew so high and fast, no fighter in the world could catch them. For over a decade, the MiG-25 remained a mystery and continued to worry Western intelligence. But that was about to change in the most dramatic way possible.
Okay. Įdomiai pasakoja istoriją.
On September 6, 1976, the Soviet Union's most secretive jet showed up seemingly out of nowhere over northern Japan. It then made a dramatic crash landing at a sleepy commercial airport, nearly colliding with an airliner and skidding right off the end of a runway.
Uh-oh.
It was the first time anyone in the West would see a MiG-25 in person. And as curious onlookers gathered, no one seemed to know where it had come from or how it got there. Piloting the MiG was 29-year-old Lieutenant Viktor Bilyenko. He was quickly taken into custody, where he explained that he escaped the Soviet Union to seek asylum in the United States. Disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union and harsh conditions at his airbase, Bilyenko had planned his escape for months. While on a training exercise over the Sea of Japan, he reported engine trouble, giving him a chance to fall back from his group. Bilyenko then descended low enough to evade radar detection. Once out of Soviet airspace, he set course for the nearest Japanese airbase. But with limited fuel and difficulty navigating, he was forced to find the nearest airport. Bilyenko was well aware that his MiG-25 was a prized possession, and he provided invaluable information to Western intelligence, who shipped his MiG to a nearby airbase to examine every inch of it.
Damn.
And they were in for a shock of a lifetime. The MiG-25 obviously wasn't the agile fighter they were expecting. Its heavy stainless steel airframe severely limited maneuverability, and the large wings were needed just to keep the jet airborne. The engines, while powerful enough to exceed Mach 3, couldn't sustain those speeds without permanent damage, meaning the practical limit was around Mach 2.8. The MiG's radar was powerful, but lacked look-down capability, meaning it couldn't track low-flying targets. The compromises that Soviet engineers were forced to make were now glaringly apparent, but they wouldn't have mattered much for intercepting a high-altitude supersonic bomber like the B-70. But the B-70 never made it into production. Instead, the Americans switched their tactics from high-speed, high-altitude to low-altitude radar and defense-evading aircraft, leaving Western intelligence perplexed as to why the MiG-25 was produced in such large numbers. The only other aircraft the interceptor would potentially have to guard against were a handful of reconnaissance aircraft. The same media that had once stoked fears about a Soviet superplane now openly mocked the MiG-25 as a...
Aš nežinau, ar rusai turėjo kažką actually gero. Nu, tipo, aš nežinau, aš labai nenusimanuotoju technologiniai karo pusė, bet aš esu girdėjęs, kur kalba ten žmonės apie tankus, kad rusai ten gyrėsi vienu ar kitu tanku ir pasirodo ten gaidys. Tada ten gyrėsi, nu, ten, va, naikintuvų, tarkim, kažkokiu, pasirodo gaidys. Ar jie turėjo iš tikrųjų kažką tikrai labai gero kariniai technikui? Ar jie labiau tiesiog skaičiais visą laikėjo? Aš nežinau. Nors ten ginčias dėl tankų, ten tie tankai visokie, literali visokie vatnikai, tai ten ginčias, oi, kad jų ten tankai zaibis ir panašiai. Bet ar jie turėjo iš tikro kažką gero, kaip ten, nežinau, dabar ten Abramsus gyrė, kad jie ten ahujieni, ten ar naikintuvai amerikiečių. Kalašas, aigės, sakot, nu, plemba, aš kalbu gal biškai didesnė technika, bet jo, nu, fair enough. Kalašas, jo.
Crudely built machine that was more or less useless in combat, an inferior aircraft that proved that the Soviets were behind in technology. Belyanka's defection outraged Soviet leadership, who demanded that he return to the Soviet Union along with the stolen MiG. Instead, Belyanka was granted American citizenship, while his MiG was sent back...
Kalašnikovas, man rodos, sukurtos ukrainiečiai šis dar geriau. Anti-oro sistemos, ta S- serija iš tikrųjų padorios. Okay, net nežinau, kas tas yra.
To the Soviet Union in dozens of pieces.
Laivynas irgi nieko ypatingai gero neturijo.
The Americans had learned everything there was to know about the MiG-25, and they now understood critical components of the Soviet air defense system. With the MiG-25 so thoroughly compromised, Soviet engineers had to work around the clock to modernize the aircraft, equipping the MiG-25 with more powerful and reliable engines, a more sophisticated look-down radar, and the ability to field a wider range of missiles. Meanwhile, older versions of the jet, no longer a closely guarded secret, were exported to other countries. In all, nearly 1,200 MiG-25s were produced. But more than 50 years later, the MiG-25 is still the fastest fighter jet ever built, an aircraft that would set 29 world records. In 1977, a MiG-25 climbed to an incredible altitude of 123,000 feet, setting a record that still stands today. Although the aircraft had been built to intercept high-altitude bombers, downgraded export versions even saw moderate success in combat. But by the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had moved on. Development of a next-generation interceptor was well underway, a jet that would have cutting-edge avionics, sophisticated engines, and a radar and weapon control system so advanced it could engage multiple targets simultaneously from 100 kilometers away and even link with other fighters to coordinate an attack, in the process instantly upgrading the capabilities of older Soviet fighters. Where the MiG-25's design was about brute force, the new MiG-31 would use the state-of-the-art to become the world's most formidable interceptor. You can learn more about the MiG-31's brilliant engineering in my latest video, now on Nebula. Nebula is where you can watch...
Okay. I don't know. Jo, įdomu, geras klausimas, ką iš tikrųjų rusai sukūrė, čia true irgi. Bet turbūt tai bus, kad biškai paima vieno, dakuria kito, ar kažkas iš tikrųjų sukūrė kažką visai nuo nulio. Visą laiką bus, kad tu skolinės iš kažko, žinai, ir tada patobulini, nebus jaučiu, nu ten, amerikiečiai jaučiu, nu, dalykus dadėjo savo, ar ne. Ar bus taip, kai ten kažkaip nuo nulio kažką visiškai paėmė. Galų galę nuo pirmų lėktuvų vis tiek visi ėmė modelių sparnai, žinai, ir panašiai, ir tada tobulino, taip turbūt ir veikia. Gal kada padarysi video, kodėl taip nebemėgsti e-sporto ir kokią tavo patirtį su tuo in detail? Not sure, ar labai daug ten žmonių, ar įdomu, ar kažką. Net nežinau, ar aš ten labai konkrečiai kažką ir pasakyčiau įdomus. Space Race didžiąją dalį laiko sovietai laimėjo. Šiaip true, tada tik mėnulis amerikiečiai aplenkė. Bet ir paskui sovietai į kosmosą skraidė, netgi amerikiečiai tengi taigi pirko iš to, tą pakilimus iš sovietų, kol SpaceX'as nenurungė jų taip liktais ten.
Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdim man kelia. Nuskink man jazminą.